Well, thank you very much for that somewhat lengthy introduction. I want to make sure that you are not falling asleep despite kind of talking about all these different points. I also have to disappoint you. For those of you who are thinking that now after we had this beautiful singing during the dinner, unfortunately I will not be providing that. So we'll have to do with just a normal presentation and actually some slides who will be coming up very shortly. Now, I'm truly honored to be here today with you and discuss with you some issues that I think are very important for the next years of Colombia, but I think that also have huge lessons for other countries, not just in Latin America. For somebody who's been coming to Colombia now for a few years, it is impressive to see how the foreign perception of what this country is all about has changed over the last few years. When I came for the first time, the main reaction was still focused on drugs, it was focused on terror, it was focused on the domestic disturbances. We all know that these issues have not completely gone away, but they are not dominant anymore. And it's very impressive for somebody from the outside to see how Colombia has been able to address these very deep, very difficult issues over the last few years. Now, what Colombia has been able to achieve has been working in a broader story of how the perception of Latin America has changed. Latin America, not just from the US, but also from many other parts of the world, was always seen as, somewhat sleepy, a little bit disorganized, not very relevant for what's going on in the rest of the world. That perception, I have to tell you, has decidedly changed. If we look at how Latin America is perceived now, it actually was one of the growth drivers of the global economy. It did much better during the recent global crisis than many other parts of the world, including Europe, where I currently live. So there's a lot of good news coming out of Latin America, coming out of Colombia. But I think what we're meeting here today, we have to realize that we're now entering a very difficult period. Because now the region, now Colombia is up to the test. Dealing for Colombia with the internal problems, the terrorism, with the political disturbances, is a big one-time gain. But the question is will it remain a big one-time gain, or is there a new model of growth that's emerging in this economy? The same is true for Latin America. A lot of the critics say, well, that the only thing that really happened is there was a natural resource boom. And Latin America was this time much better than in the past of using that natural resource boom, kind of conducive conditions in the global economy, and okay, let's concede it. A lot of countries, including Colombia, have really gotten their fiscal and monetary policies much more in order than they did before. But the question many researchers point out is, has the region and has Colombia changed enough in terms of its fundamental conditions for business so that there will be much more dynamism in the future, that we really see that this was a step change in the way that the country and the region is changing? So in this context, of course, what the CPC is doing is right on target. Because the solution, the answer, will have to come from consistently upgrading underlying competitiveness. And this is what I want to talk about over the next 30, 45 minutes or so. So first of all, I want to start off or build on the discussions that we had this morning already, both from President Santos when he talked about the achievements, but also the 20-year history that Colombia has had in dealing with competitiveness issues. And then with the presentation that we heard from Rosario about the competitiveness report that really goes in detail into a diagnostic of Colombia. Let's add to that a little bit from an outside perspective. What has Colombia achieved given the significant investments that this country has made in building up a structure, in instituting policies, in trying to listen to outside advice on what should be done to improve the competitiveness of this country? Then I want to move a little bit to discuss industrial policy, or the new industrial policy, and I hope that this will build on and in many ways connect to a discussion that I'm sure Danny Roderick had here last year. The question is, how can Colombia add to the horizontal agenda that has been dominant for quite a while in more effectively building specific sectors? And very closely connected with that question is, what really should be the value proposition of this country in the future? What are the industries, the type of activities that you want to see being associated with Colombia when you go out in the world in 5 or 10 or 15 years from now? To get there, we need to think about this concept of new industrial policy. Now, talking about concepts is relatively easy for somebody that's not from Colombia, you know, as an academic, it's ideas, so I can talk about those. I will then try to do something at the end which is much more difficult. I hope you will still bear with me. What I want to talk a little bit about is implementation. Because I think one of the critical issues that Colombia is facing is not that there's a shortage of ideas or shortage of policies, but that you're not getting enough returns from the policies that have been instituted, from the institutions that have been created. And that has to do with implementation. Now, one of my activities that was mentioned here is that I happen to be the president of a global network, not of academics, but of practitioners in the field of competitiveness and cluster development. And the reason that I find that so interesting and so honored to work with many practitioners is because I see that's really where the difference often lies. Countries that are more successful have managed what somebody called the science of delivery. They are not only good in writing good plans, they are very good in putting these plans into action. And so at the end, I will try to talk a little bit about some issues that as an outsider, I think might be worthwhile for you to look at as you think about implementing these new efforts. Now let's then start to look a little bit at Colombia, and I'll not do a full-blown analysis of the country's competitiveness. That has been excellently done already in the report and has been referred. So I'll just add a little bit the perspective from somebody who looks at this from the outside. Now, first of all, I think what is really setting Colombia apart is the number of policies, the strategies, and the institutional architecture that you have put in place that has been dealing with competitiveness over the last 20 years. This is really unique. You should be proud of it, and you should know that, in fact, it is so unique that my colleague, Professor Jorge Ramirez, has written an HBS case about that. So we're looking at the Colombian experience and try to learn from that. And Rosario was a guest in our class, looking with our students at what has happened. This is not what you see in many other countries. In fact, this is what we tell many other countries. Build these type of structures. Build structures that engage the private sector, that organize across the government sector, that go down into the regions. So many of these things that you would usually advise are already in place in Colombia. But it's a little bit like with the food that you had on your table. It can look very nice, but the question is, does it really taste well? Does it really feed you? And so, let's just take a quick look at the outcome. And arguably, one of the key outcome indicators is prosperity, GDP per capita. We'll look at other things as well. But if you look at that for Colombia, the story is pretty good. I'd say, the glass is half full. We've seen, pretty solid rate of growth, prosperity growth. And we've seen that rate of growth kind of slowly picking up over the last few years as there was more progress in terms of domestic peace and in terms of economic reforms. So we see that moving along. Now let's look at how this compares with some of the other countries, and let's start with our neighbors or our broader region in Latin America. So this looks at the last 12 years or so it's a longer period. It really tries to see what has happened over longer periods of time, because that's when the underlying changes really kick in. And even here, Colombia is kind of in the middle. It's not bad. There are other places that have been doing better. And you can look at the individual cases, but we're still in a position that's kind of relatively good. Now, what I've tried to do to add then is international peers that are basically at similar levels of prosperity. And if you look at that group, both Colombia and Latin America doesn't look that great anymore. And that might be because maybe we've been doing better here at the end of this period while other countries have struggled. But overall, I think there's still quite a bit of work to do. We're doing fine, we're doing okay, but we're doing not excellent. And so I think the lesson just from this very quick data at some of the very high-level output indicators is that there is a positive trend. But gee, given all the kinds of things that we've done over the last 20 years, shouldn't there be more? shouldn't we be able to reach higher levels of growth, higher levels of prosperity improvement? Why isn't that happening? Now, to answer that question, I think it's important to go back and really think a little bit about what is our thinking about economic growth, these underlying drivers of prosperity improvements over time. And Danny Roderick might have talked a little bit about this already last year, but what we've seen is really an enormous change in the type of thinking that we had over the previous decades, and let's say over the last 5 or 10 years or so. So the way that we thought classically about this, and the way that we still teach mostly at our universities, is that there is one individual factor that's very critical to explain growth. And what that individual factor is, that has changed a little bit over time. So we started out with capital, very important papers that said, you need machinery, that's what makes people productive and that makes them prosperous. We then realized that capital is not enough. People need the skills, knowledge to be able to operate that machinery. And then we realized that they not only need the skills and the machinery, they need the right incentives and institutional structures. And institutions is still one of the key factors that economists think that over longer periods of time really explain why some locations do well and others do not so well. But the basic idea is always that economists have been looking at this holy grail. What's the key answer, the one thing that you need to get right in order to become rich? And this is where I think we've seen a little bit of a sea change in perspective over the last couple of years. I think there has been a realization that there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that you need to get right. What the question is really, there are many factors that matter, and we talked about a lot of them already today. We talked about infrastructure, we talked about skills, we talked about taxation, we talked about fiscal policy, the list goes on and on and on. Importantly, and especially as you move from basic institutions and broader macroeconomic policies to more the micro side, the business environment conditions, what is also true that these factors interact. So a skilled worker is worth much more for a company if it also has access to good logistical infrastructure so that it can sell the products that the skilled worker is using. So we need to think about how qualities in these different areas work together. Overall, what this means is that we need to think much more about the location-specific context. What's the situation on all these different indicators right now? Only then can we really say, this is what we need to do to improve things in a way that has a meaningful impact on companies. Another very important insight, and that's something that I'll get back to when we talk about new industrial policy, is that there are these two levels of factors. There is what you call the horizontal agenda. There are things that really affect everyone. We just need to get right, basic legal structure, certainly basic education and so on, basic infrastructure. But if we move to higher levels of prosperity, we also need to understand what's happening in specific markets, in specific industries, in specific groups of sectors. Policy need to recognize what are the needs there and need to work with those. And that's still a very dicey question, so I'll come back to that. There has been a lot of mistakes been made, and I'll share a little bit some of the thinking that you see that has evolved over the last few years. The final point is that priorities shift over time. So as you think about your strategies, you really always need to look at what are we doing? What is it that is right now the priority? Turning this around, what's also true is that you can't at any point in time try to address all your weaknesses. That's a recipe for disaster. Companies don't do that either. They try to figure out what are the critical things that I need to do now that bring me to the next level, and then I move to the next level of issues. And there I must say, from our discussion so far, I heard a little bit too little of that. We talked about many issues, but we didn't really hear a lot about prioritization. What is the critical thing that we need to move forward? Now, one of the implications of this new type of thinking is that there has been much more interest in data and facts. Why is that? Well, because if it's just one thing that drives economic growth, you can just apply that recipe in every other country and say, we know what you need to do. Don't need to bother with the local specificities. We'll just implement the same thing. That was a little bit the kind of Washington consensus idea. Now, if it is true that what is really driving growth is much more location-specific and it's about the interaction of factors, we first need to understand what's going on in that location. So if you want to do that diagnostic, you need to start and really looking at the outcomes, and there are different indicators here. The ultimate objectives, what you really worry about as a policymaker. It's not only GDP per capita. I'll talk about some of the other, or one of the other indicators in a minute. You need to look at some of the so-called intermediate indicators, so things that describe economic activity, like investment rate, like exports, like patenting rates, and so on, that we know are usually pretty good for prosperity, but they're not a goal in themselves, but they help us understand what's going on in the economy. And then there is the underlying factors of competitiveness, macroeconomic, institutional, microeconomic, that are really the root causes of what's going on in terms of outcomes. These are particularly important because if you want to change your economy, this is what you need to change. It's not enough to kind of change the taxes a little bit so that we export more. We need to understand what are the root causes for low exports and address those, rather than to kind of fiddle with the symptoms. We can't be a doctor that says, oh, you have fever, well, I'll just give you something that the fever goes down. We need to understand why the body has fever and then address these type of issues. So I think it's because of this that the work that CPC is doing, both the regional index but also the national index, is enormously important. It is partly for the reason that President Santos pointed out. You know, if we want to measure whether we're making any progress, we need to have facts. You know, we can't just wave our hands. And the reports are providing that. But it's also that if we want to decide about priorities, ideology, theory, subjective positions will not help us. We need facts, and I think we need to kind of harvest these reports a little bit more in that direction. Now let me just give you some data points that I thought kind of stood out. Where Colombia, compared to this peer group of regional but also global peers, kind of is quite different. And you know, there's some explaining to do. One remains inequality. I know there has been quite a lot of progress in a growing middle class and addressing poverty and so on, but we still do see that this is a country that's kind of riven by differences in prosperity. Every sustainable economic policy strategy needs to think about this. If you only create opportunities for the people that are already skilled and are successful, this is not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough economically, but it's also not going to be enough politically. So here are things where you need to say, you know, inequality, what is driving this? Why do we still have that? How can we deal with these issues? And there are many other factors behind this, the high rate of informality and so on, that you need to look at. Another factor that's very striking, and which is kind of more the modern economy, is export intensity. Now, exports as a percentage of GDP is kind of a questionable indicator because it depends on country size and so on. If you're a very small country, you of course export more, and so that matters. But it's still striking to see how little Colombia exports. And I think that's something that we need to look at a little bit more, where we need to understand, and again, that I didn't think was a really priority of the discussion so far. But it is a sign quite often, or this has been a pathway for countries to be successful. Associated with exports is, if we look at the composition of our exports and we look at, well, have we gained market share over the last decade or so, it's still pretty much natural resource-driven type of clusters and industries. And this is a framework that we use at our institute at Harvard, kind of organize industries around these cluster groups. But what we, the size of the bubble is basically the total value of exports, and then if you're higher up, you have a higher market share. If you're more to the right, you've gained world market share over this decade. So what we see is, still huge dominance, essentially, of very traditional products. And I know that, Danny Roderick and Ricardo Hausmann have looked a lot at that, and we'll come back later to the policy conclusion that this has. Now, that was outcomes, ultimate outcomes, intermediate outcomes. What about competitiveness? And here, this just reflects some of the results that you've already heard in the presentation earlier on. Where does Colombia stand overall? And the way that we try to organize it is kind of have one pillar that looks more at the micro level, which is driven by what companies do, broader institutions, but also government, and then the macro level on the other side. Huge improvements in macroeconomic policy. Institutional issues are still there, and we heard a little bit from the president about that this morning. and micro kind of a mixed picture. Now, this is a little bit too positive, if you will, because you know, I think the question has to be asked, is it enough for Colombia to be at a level of 75? Yes, that's in line with our prosperity, but if we want to grow, we really need to move much further than we've done here. Now, if I look like a picture like this, I think the impression that I get is that this is probably a country that's going to be able to grow quite solidly for the next few years based on domestic demand. It's a large enough country that has a growing population. Because, you know, there's macroeconomic stability, so companies will continue to invest. They've learned how to deal with the vagaries of the institutional system and the cost of doing business, and there's a market that's attractive. Foreign companies will also come in, you know, if the macroeconomic policy is all right. But if I look at this as an investor that thinks about export platforms, I'm not quite sure whether I see a real competitive advantage here. What is the area in which Colombia is so attractive that I want to locate here, not to just serve a growing Colombian market, but Latin America or even other markets in the world? Now, one other issue is to look at changes over time, and it's always dicey with this survey data, so you can question that. But what we see here is, you know, this is from the survey data over the last couple of years. There are improvements in some areas, especially macro policy, where it's hard data. Also in the administrative infrastructure, and I think that reflects what we see in the doing business indicator, which measures exactly that. But we see a lot of other issues where there have been negative movements, at least in the perceptions. And let me just point out one, which again, that we haven't talked much about, and that is kind of this whole issue of context for rivalry, the dynamism of markets, the openness of markets, the absence of market power, and so on. We talked a lot about infrastructure and skills, talked about taxes and so on. We talked a little bit about taxes that made it easier to work on the labor market. But it seems that Colombia has also a big agenda to think about in opening up markets and making sure that there's more competition, first internally, to get companies get used to that. But that will be the necessary text for your companies to then be able to also compete successfully outside of the country. Now, this is not easy here because some of the limits of contestable markets have to do with geography and transportation costs and so on, but this means that you have to work even harder to impose strict antitrust rules and things like that. So there are a couple of the issues that we discussed in terms of outcomes: inequality, unsophisticated product structure, low level of internationalization, drivers, institutions, infrastructure, market distortions that are there to look at. Let's try to pull this together. First of all, the country has really achieved a lot. It has made huge improvements in a number of policy areas, especially monetary policy, but also others. It has been very open to importing ideas, you know, worked with clusters and other ideas like that for 20 years. And it has established this national system for competitiveness, so a robust structure of people that are working together. Why isn't this working? Well, I'll just put up some of the hypotheses, and hopefully that will trigger some discussion later on. One impression from the outside is that while you do have many good policies, you have also other policies that work at cross purposes. So you're kind of neglecting yourself the benefits of the good choices that you're making, because there are still too many distortions in markets. Second issue has to do with institutional capacity. I'll get back to that in a minute, but sometimes you get the impression that there's a very sophisticated policy debate here, but a policy debate that's probably beyond the capacity of the people that are then actually in charge of implementing it. So what's the right tool given the context that you have here? Private sector involvement is, you know, is great here. It's really impressive to see how many people come and engage in this debate. But is it there also at the regional level? Is it there sufficiently at the level of industries and clusters? I think that's at least something to look at. You've talked about clusters for a long time, but has it been sustained? We'll get back to that. And then finally, and I think that's a point that President Santos rightly made, many economic policies, especially on micro, take time. You know, if you talk about education system reform, not quite clear whether we always give it enough time, and maybe we also just need to wait a little bit more and see how these things work out. So a lot of potential areas. What I want to dig into now is a little bit what more can we do in terms of the vertical agenda? What does the new industrial policy maybe offer us in terms of tools that we can use, because that's clearly one of the things that we need to address to improve the sophistication of our economic activities. Now, when we talk about industrial policy, I think it's important to keep the history in mind. So there was an old history of industrial policy that said, well, you know, there are market failures, there are economies of scale, there are learning effects, all of these things. And so what you need to do is you need to shelter your domestic industry, at least for a while, and then it's large and productive, and you'll succeed. And basically, you know, I think the theory on that, I think, is somewhat plausible. The practice has been a disaster almost everywhere. And that's why many countries, including, you know, the OECD, which you want to become soon a member of, basically moved totally away from that and said, you know, let's forget about all the sectoral stuff. Let's just do what they call framework conditions, the general things that are important for the entire economy. But now, over the last few years, I think there's a growing realization that, A, you know, that's not the true reality in many countries. We still have sectoral policies. And B, it's probably also not the right way to think about this, because if you want to help companies become more productive, you need to understand their specific context, not just the general context. So there is something about upgrading sectors, but also about changing the sectors in which you are active. And I'll talk a little bit about these two notions. Now, very important in this change in thinking has been new evidence that is coming about from research over the last few years. So first of all, in terms of the sectors, you see that here on the left-hand side, there is clear evidence that richer countries are engaged in different sectors and different types of economic activities than poorer countries. So there is no argument about that. We also know that there are huge differences across sectors in all of these other indicators that we worry about: innovation, entrepreneurship, job growth, wages, and so on. So there's clear evidence on that. We also have, over the last few years, gained very clear empirical evidence that the presence of clusters, so related groups of industries in certain locations, has a positive impact on prosperity, innovation, entrepreneurship, job growth, wages. And that the type of clusters that you have today kind of predicts which clusters you likely are going to have in the future. So there's kind of an evolutionary process. That's what the facts say. But now, you know, you let academics in the room and they start arguing about what these facts mean. They're two quite different perspectives. They share a lot of the same ground, but I want to highlight the differences because they're very important for policy. So Porter's work on clusters then essentially said, it's not so important what you do, but how well you do it. And in order to improve what you're doing, you need to think about clusters, you need to understand the business environment of a cluster, and then do that better. So essentially, to get rich, do what you do, just do it much better. And he talks about, you know, how Italian shoemakers still sustain very high wages, and, you know, you have agro-production in places like New Zealand or France that is very successful, and so on. The worker Hausman and Roderick and Lin, the former chief economist at the World Bank, has a slightly different bent to it, because they focus more on the fact that rich countries do different things from poor countries. And so the implication is, if you want to be rich, you ultimately have to do what the rich countries do. So one basically says, you know, upgrading within a sector. The other says moving from one sector to another. Now let's start on what they agree on. I think both perspectives say that we need to really say goodbye to the old tools of industrial policy that limited competition, that used subsidies, created national champions, and so on, focused on creating private profitability, hoping that the companies would use that money to then upgrade and become better. Both perspectives say, no, what we need is to upgrade business environments, enhance the dynamics in these sectors, and make sure that the companies really become more innovative and more productive. So that's what there is agreement on. What there is less agreement on is whether we should actively drive structural change. Now, and I think some of the analysis that I've been doing with my colleagues seems to indicate that the process of structural change is really tightly intertwined with upgrading of the business environment. So it's not that you can move into a new sector, a more higher value added sector, but the reason that you're not in that sector is often that you don't have the right type of business environment. So if you want to go in this area, really think about the business environment improvements that you need to do. Use the data about sectoral composition as a diagnostic tool, but then focus on improving the environment rather than trying to create new industries, trying to create new sectors. Be very careful about setting these policy targets. You know, in Europe and the US, we now have targets for industry, which I think is very dangerous, but if you look at the policies, of course, they will never achieve these targets because there's no agreement on the intervention that this should supply. But we do know that we need to change from old sectors to new sectors. So how do we do this? Well, the old answer was we identify sectors that seem to have high potential, bio, nano, IT, finance, whatever, that's high paid, that you would like to have. And we go into that. And the failure rate has been very high because often the business environment just wasn't right. So the new approach, and this is sometimes called new industrial policy, in Europe we talk about this in the context of smart specialization, a term that the OECD also use. The idea is to say, well, let's look where you are today, but then stretch ourselves and see what's the next level. What are the related higher value industries that we can get into, but where we have some advantage because of what we do today? And what are the things that we can do if we improve our business environment somewhat, but build on the things that we have today? So there is a new approach here in new industrial policy that is sector focused, that does provide a perspective on how you can get this, how you can get structural change done, but that is still relatively careful about not making these huge investments and bets by the government on what sectors are going to be out there in the future. Now, one important point is that you really need to start aligning your policy tools very much by the type of industries and clusters and their stage of development. So we've learned quite well how we work with established industries and clusters, where there's a lot of economic activity, companies that have met the market test. We can help them build cluster initiatives, other type of structures, and do that. But what do you do if these structures don't exist, whether these industries are not there, because these are areas in which you want to go? Well, here you need a different type of policy tool. And even countries that have been doing that for a long time, we still are pretty bad at that. We use the same tool that worked well for established industries, but we now apply it to industries that barely exist. That makes the government the entrepreneur, and that's not the model that works very well. If you go into these new sectors, you need to manage risk, you need to limit your capital exposure, and you need to be very clear on what are the performance targets so that you can react to market signals. This is, by the way, what countries like Korea did. They set very hard targets for the companies, and the companies that were not able to meet those targets, they were cut off government support. So use the market as government. Do not try to substitute the market by making the government the entrepreneur. So we talked a little bit about Colombia's competitiveness situation. We talked a little bit about this idea of new industrial policy and the need to move into new areas. Now let's talk a little bit about effective implementation. And I want to address 4 issues here. The role of the private and the public sector, given the audience here. I want to talk about the role of regions and what that might mean for Colombia. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of strategy and so-called science of delivery. Now let's start with the role of the private sector. I think there's a very clear observation that as you move away from these big institutional changes and macroeconomic policies to more micro-oriented areas, you need to have a different model of economic policy. You need to engage the private sector in very different ways, and also other institutions like academia. You need to create structures like the private council where collaboration and discussion becomes possible. We know that, but making it happen is very hard. So what have we learned in terms of what are factors that make it much more likely that this public-private collaboration becomes more than just another kind of term that we use in the debate? First of all, it's very important to have a common language. So some of our Spanish friends in the Basque Country, they basically had a course where all the public and private sector leaders went through. And they still disagreed afterwards, but at least they had the same language. They knew what they were disagreeing on. Second, and this is again where this report that was published today is very important, we need to have a common understanding of what is the reality of our economy. We've done many surveys that ask public sector leaders and private sector leaders about how they view different aspects of the competitiveness of their location. And it's striking that these two constituencies seem to live in totally different realities. They seem to live in different locations. Now, if you don't agree on what the reality is, it's very hard to come to an agreement on what should be done, and even harder to work together to implementing it. There needs to be a shared view on action priorities, so there needs to be some process, and there needs to be a clear understanding on who should do what, and I'll get back to that a little bit. And finally, there needs to be trust. I will not comment on Colombia, you know that, and I don't. I just see that in many countries there is a tendency for the private sector to say, oh, you know, the public sector is just completely useless. These guys are just after votes. They are not really interested in long-term prosperity of our country. And on the public sector side, you see them that say, oh, well, these private entrepreneurs, they are just interested in their money. They're not interested in society and building the commons and all of those things. It takes time to overcome these perspectives. But that's what makes rich and successful countries rich and successful. That you respect that there are differences and objectives, but you do find a common ground and respect your roles that you have. And Colombia, I think, needs to ask itself, you know, how far are we on this way, and then align your structures accordingly. Now, one of the set of issues that I think is very important for new industrial policy is that you remain clear about what the private sector should do, what firms should do, and what governments should do. It's perfectly all right, and I think there's a very good argument, and Roderick and Hausman kind of established that beautifully academically, that there are positive externalities for companies going into new industries and new markets. And so there is a case for government supporting them in that. What is dangerous, however, is if there is a government working group that says, you know, let's figure out what these markets should be. I think you need to create structures where it remains the responsibility of the entrepreneurs to say, here's an opportunity that I see, and make that a little bit more likely for them to take the plunge, to try it. But entrepreneurship means taking the risk. It means benefiting from the risk as well, if it works out very well. So I think that is something that is very important. Firms, of course, then ultimately compete, but government needs to react to market signals. The problem with a lot of the plans that say, you know, these are our 5 sectors that will drive our economy in the future, is that there's little built-in flexibility. But markets change, and companies react to that. They always review their strategies, and they say, okay, you know, this is still a market that we want to be in, given the market signals that we're getting. Government needs to do the same. It needs to become much better in listening to the market signals and adjust accordingly. Now, I know that the dynamics are built against that, because for government, getting out of a sector always means failure, and that, you know, invites political criticism. But we need to become better at these processes. Finally, when we talk about what needs to be done to make the companies more competitive and more productive, this is something that the companies need to have the first word on. What worries me the most in Europe, where I spend a lot of my time, is that we always have government officials saying, oh, you have not internationalized enough, or you need to innovate more. How should they know? I mean, they are not in the position competing in the market every day. So we need, you know, you need to challenge the private sector, but ultimately that's where the need needs to come from. And I think that's very important for Colombia to find the right mix. Now let's move to the second issue, which is the balance between the national and the regional level. How can we leverage this? And you know, there are a few countries, it's important in many countries, but Colombia is one of the countries where it's truly critical. Because you are a country of very different regions, and we just heard an excellent presentation about how they differ in competitiveness, in many structures and so on. You have a big asset in your country, because you actually do have many different cities that have economic weight, that can do things. Many other emerging economies are much more concentrated in 1 or 2 locations. I think you have a real asset for the future, but you need to think about what does the national government have to do, and what does the regional government have to do? Now, the older picture of this was something like that. Essentially, the government, the national government, because that's where the money were, this is where the legislative power sits, they control most of the things, and then the regional government delivers services that they have to deliver, local infrastructure and so on. They basically execute the kind of framework that's been set out. Now, I think what we increasingly see is that regional government, even if it does not have huge fiscal resources, even if it does not have legal powers, which in some countries it does, has many other roles. It can think about what are the type of firms, what are the type of human resources, what are the type of activities that we want to attract to our region. What is our plan? What's our strategy? It can think about how does it mobilize the local networks, the economic activities that you find in a certain region. And it can make decisions about which type of national program it wants to leverage. So if there is a new university that needs to be built, should I go after that? Or should I, as a region, rather try to focus getting some more of that infrastructure fund that the national government is talking about? So there's a lot of choices that the regional government makes. Now, connecting that to the industrial policy, I think this perspective of clusters is important for all of these issues. When you think about what dimensions of the business environment to strengthen, you can use cluster data to see where's critical mass. You can use the cluster groups that you're building now through the different programs to really get their feedback and say, okay, there's a limited amount of money here. What is it that's really most important to you? You can think about what networks are there that you can mobilize and work with these networks to then improve the quality of your economic policies. And finally, I think we see in many places that the attraction of firms and skills, if it is organized around clusters, especially existing clusters, is much more effective. Because then you're not just selling, oh, we're open for business, please come. But you're selling something specific. You're saying, we have 200 plastic companies. Wouldn't that be a good opportunity for you to be there as well? And you actually create value for your companies that are already in place. So there's lots of things that can be done. Now, what does it mean for cluster and new industrial policy? First of all, we have to realize there are different types of clusters. So there are established clusters with national importance, and you know who those are, that are big and important for exports. There are established clusters at the regional level, and then there are industries where we think that these might be able to help us in the future. National and regional governments have very different roles in these. So for the established clusters, it's really the regional government, I think, that should have the lead. They can identify who they are, they have local networks to work with, and then they can draw on national resources to help with them. For the established clusters with national presence, at the minimum, I think we need some sort of national coordination, and that's true in many countries, that there you need much stronger role, top-down and bottom-up. For the potential industries, I think the lead should come from the national government. There is no location yet that has been sorted out by the market as the most efficient for these new activities. And you need to be very open where that might be. So it's much better to say, let's look at these sectors, wherever they come up, bring national networks together to explore them, and then, do let regions compete for those and say, we want to create the best environment for this type of new sector that comes. National and regional government both have their roles. It's about making clear how they click, how they relate to each other. It's not just about shifting power from one to another. We know that to make cluster efforts effective, we know that to make business environment upgrading effective, you need decentralization, because the local knowledge and the local activities are in the region. They are not in the capital. But we also know that to make that happen, you also need institutional capacity. And I think the challenge for a country like Colombia is, how do you build these two up in parallel? There are many cases of other countries, Indonesia, Russia, that have gone ahead with decentralization and then pulled back because it led to chaos. It led to a situation where we didn't create enough. Colombia has regions that are so heterogeneous that I think you probably need a structure that is very robust and offers different models. It offers regions that are very competitive much more room to make their choices, and maybe in regions that do not have that capacity, has the national government stepping in much more with help and support, and sometimes also with taking over the decisions. How that looks like, that's for you to figure out, but I think you need to be careful not to think that a simple solution in a country as complex as Colombia is going to work. Now let me just run through the last two ideas. The idea of economic strategy. First of all, I think what we've seen in the past is good strategies had outcome objectives, which we saw here also, the ones that Rosario talked about, then action plans, and then they assign responsibility, sometimes also budgets. But what is often missing, and I think that's also missing for me a little bit in Colombia, is what is the value proposition of this location? For what type of activities? Why should I come? That's just not clear. And you know, if you sell as a businessman a product, you know that customers don't buy your product because you have addressed a weakness. They come because there is a certain thing that they really like. And I think Colombia has to think about that. What is a certain thing or the combination of factors that really drives this country forward? Looking at the past, I think there are three things where problems have happened. First of all, you know, more discipline. It seems like you have good strategies, generally sensible plans, but then you also do a lot of other policies that are not in line with those strategies. You don't think enough about mutually reinforcing policies, so how do I connect skills and infrastructure and internationalization? And then I think strategy is very important to set the direction, because only then will you get the reinforcing investments from the private sector. The private sector wants to know where it goes. You know, what's the direction? What can I expect 5, 10 years from now when I now think about making an investment in this new machinery or educating people? That is something that Colombia, I think, can reap much higher benefits than it has in the past. Finally, the signs of delivery. So we know that strategy is important. We know that then a structure to deliver that strategy is important. But then it's really about implementation. It's about having the right kind of skills and resources, the right type of operational practices, incentives, and systematic learning to make sure that this is happening. There are many issues here, I think, for Colombia. First of all, be, I think, more careful of aligning policies with capabilities. Don't try to overstretch. Have something that's robust relative to the quality of your institutions. And I think that often means simplify. To me, it sounds often there's too many different things going on at the same time. Make it simpler, easier, clearer overall message. And then a key point is really, and that might be something for the reports in the future, to also look at systematic evaluation of programs and say, okay, what has been their impact? What can we learn? Not in order to say, you know, this was a failure, but in order to make them better. You can only make things better if you say, okay, here is where it didn't work out quite as we wanted to. And that is, I think, becoming more and more recognized in many areas. And I think if you're part of the OECD, that'll be great, because they can help you exactly with those type of issues. Final slide. I think, you know, it's easy to complain about the public sector, and there's a time for that. But since the private sector here is largely in the room, I think it's important to think about what is the key role that you have in this overall process. First of all, it starts in the companies. Colombia is only going to be more competitive if the Colombian companies are going to be more competitive. Now, many of the large companies have already made big strides over the last few years, have become much better, have internationalized, or active in Latin America. But many of your smaller companies have not. And I think that's where the idea of clusters becomes very important. How can you help build up the quality of these thousands of smaller companies? And not just as a service to the national economy, but what we see in advanced countries is that if you don't have good suppliers, you find it very hard to succeed internationally as a company in the future. And I'm sure Colombian companies, large companies, will get to that point as well. Hold government responsible for upgrading competitiveness, and for that CPC is a very important part. To be an active partner in government in the design and implementation, I think we have to learn that it's not just lobbying for certain changes, but working with them. And then finally, I think that's something that's also very important when our discussions at HBS with the US private sector is, of course, the political outcome is also driven by the lobbying of the private sector. And if we complain about company policies that are going at cross purposes and too much, you know, special deals for special groups, we need to think about what we can do as the private sector to stop that. I think that's a responsibility that many, you know, I don't know who, probably the people that this is most relevant for are not in the room, but I think it is true that we need to make sure that the role of the private sector in influencing policy needs to also hold itself to a high standard of upgrading competitiveness rather than gaining short-term benefits for your individual industry. Thank you very much.